Christopher Columbus, Italian explorer. Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean from Spain 4 times, in 1492, 1493, 1498, and 1502. He was adamant about finding a direct water route west from Europe to Asia, but he never succeeded. Instead, he discovered the Americas. Though he did not discover the so-called New World, millions of people already lived there. His expeditions marked the start of centuries of exploration and colonization of North and South America. Christopher Columbus and the Age of Discovery. Several European leaders sponsored expeditions abroad during the 15th and 16th centuries in the hope that explorers would discover great wealth and vast undiscovered lands. The Portuguese were among the first to take part in this age of discovery, also known as the Age of Exploration. Small Portuguese ships known as caravels zipped along the African coast beginning around 1420, transporting spices, gold, and other goods as well as enslaved people from Asia and Africa to Europe. Other European countries, particularly Spain, were eager to share the Far East's seemingly limitless riches. By the end of the 15th century, Spain's Reconquista, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the kingdom after centuries of war, had been completed, and the country shifted its focus to exploration and conquest in other parts of the world. Early life and nationality. Christopher Columbus, the son of a wool merchant, is thought to have been born in 1451 in Genoa, Italy. He got a job on a merchant ship while he was still a teenager. He sailed until 1476, when his ship was attacked by pirates as it sailed north along the Portuguese coast. The ship sank, but the young Columbus floated to shore on a scrap of wood and eventually made his way to Lisbon, where he studied mathematics, astronomy, cartography, and navigation. He also started working on the plan that would change the world forever. The first voyage. It was nearly impossible to reach Asia by land from Europe at the end of the 15th century. The journey was long and difficult, with encounters with hostile armies difficult to avoid. Portuguese explorers solved this problem by sailing south along West Africa's coast and around the Cape of Good Hope. But Columbus had a different plan. Why not sail west across the Atlantic instead of around Africa? Although the young navigator's logic was sound, his math was flawed. He incorrectly argued that the circumference of the Earth was much smaller than his contemporaries believed. As a result, he believed that traveling by boat from Europe to Asia should be not only possible, but also relatively easy via an as yet undiscovered Northwest Passage. He presented his plan to Portuguese and English officials, but it wasn't until 1492 that he found a sympathetic audience, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Columbus desired notoriety and fortune. Ferdinand and Isabella desired the same thing, as well as the opportunity to spread Catholicism throughout the world. Columbus' contract with the Spanish rulers stipulated that he could keep 10% of any riches he discovered, as well as a noble title and governorship of any lands he came across. Christopher Columbus' ships, Nina, Pinto, and Santa Maria. Columbus and his crew set sail from Spain on August 3, 1492, in 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The ships arrived on October 12, not in the East Indies, as Columbus had assumed, but on one of the Bahamian islands, most likely San Salvador. Columbus sailed from island to island in what is now known as the Caribbean for months, looking for the pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, and other objects and merchandise whatsoever he had promised his Spanish patrons. But he did not find much. He left for Spain in January 1493, leaving several dozen men behind in a makeshift settlement on Hispaniola. During his first voyage, he kept a detailed diary. Between August 3, 1492, and November 6, 1492, Christopher Columbus kept a journal in which he wrote about everything from the wildlife he encountered, such as dolphins and birds, to the weather and the moods of his crew. Worryingly, it also recorded his first impressions of the locals as well as his justification for enslaving them. They brought us parrots, cotton balls, spears, and many other things, which they exchanged for glass beads and hawks' bells. He wrote something. They gladly exchanged everything they owned. They were well built, with nice bodies and attractive features. They don't have arms and don't know what they are, because when I showed them a sword, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They don't have any iron. They'd make excellent servants. We could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we wanted with 50 men. Christopher Columbus's later voyages. Columbus returned to the Americas 6 months later, in September 1493. He discovered the Hispaniola settlement destroyed and left his brothers Bartolomeo and Diego Columbus, as well as a portion of his ship's crew and hundreds of enslaved indigenous people, to rebuild. Then he went west to continue his mostly futile search for gold and other valuables. His group now included a large number of indigenous peoples who had been enslaved by Europeans. He sent 500 enslaved people to Queen Isabella in lieu of the material riches he had promised the Spanish monarchs. The queen was appalled, believing that any people Columbus discovered were Spanish subjects who could not be enslaved, and promptly and sternly returned the explorer's gift. Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic for the third time in May 1498, before returning to the ill-fated Hispaniola settlement, where the colonists had staged a bloody revolt against the Columbus brothers' mismanagement and brutality. He visited Trinidad and the South American mainland. The situation was so bad that the Spanish government had to send a new governor to take over. Meanwhile, the native Taino population was decimated as they were forced to search for gold and work on plantations. Christopher Columbus was arrested and imprisoned before being returned to Spain. The aging Columbus persuaded the Spanish crown to pay for one last trip across the Atlantic in 1502. After being cleared of the most serious charges but stripped of his noble titles, Columbus made it all the way to Panama, just miles from the Pacific Ocean, where he was forced to abandon 2 of his 4 ships due to storm damage and hostile natives. The explorer returned to Spain empty-handed, where he died in 1506. Legacy of Christopher Columbus. The Americas were not discovered by Christopher Columbus, nor was he the first European to visit the New World. His journey, however, sparked centuries of exploration and exploitation on the American continents. The Columbian exchange brought people, animals, food, and disease from one culture to another. Old World wheat became a food staple in the United States. African coffee and Asian sugarcane became cash crops for Latin America, while American foods such as corn, tomatoes, and potatoes entered European diets. Today, Columbus is remembered as a daring and trailblazing explorer who transformed the New World. But his actions also unleashed changes that would eventually devastate the native populations he and his fellow explorers encountered.